Jake Taylor, a 12-year-old boy, had always lived in a quiet, peaceful neighborhood. He and his mom, Catherine, had made it their home after his father's passing 2 years ago. His father, Daniel, had been a great man, but his sudden death had left an undeniable hole in their lives. Catherine, a nurse at the local hospital, worked long hours to provide for them both, leaving Jake to find his own way at home after school. Jake didn't mind, though. Their life wasn't luxurious, but they managed. Catherine worked hard, and Jake tried his best to stay out of trouble. Maplewood, their small suburban town, was known for its friendly neighbors and low crime rates. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, or at least thought they did. The streets were lined with oak trees, the yards were tidy, and there was always a welcoming atmosphere. Jake liked this, but he also hated it. Everything in Maplewood was predictable. Everyone was friendly, but too friendly. Everyone knew everyone's business. It wasn't as if Jake didn't like people. He did. But sometimes the small-town life felt like it was closing in on him. It was a late autumn day when the incident happened. Jake was walking home from school as usual, his backpack bouncing against his back, the chill of the air biting through his jacket. He was humming a song his music teacher had introduced in class, the notes a small comfort. It was one of those afternoons when the world seemed to be slowing down, the trees shedding their golden leaves, the sun low in the sky. He took his usual shortcut through the park, a path he'd walked 1,000 times. The park was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves blowing in the wind. Jake liked the park. It was peaceful, with an old fountain at the center surrounded by trees. It felt like a place he could escape to when he needed some time to think. As he neared the fountain, Jake noticed two men standing off to the side. At first, they looked unremarkable. They were arguing, but the voices were too soft for him to hear. He slowed his pace, feeling his curiosity draw him in. The men looked like any other strangers he'd seen in the park, but there was an intensity to the conversation that made Jake uneasy. He tried to ignore them, keeping his head down as he walked past. Then, there was a loud sound, a sharp crack, like glass shattering. Jake froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He turned to look at the men, his eyes widening as he saw one of them clutching a shiny object, a knife. The other man took a step back, his hands raised in defense, his face pale with fear. "I told you to stay out of this," the man with the knife shouted, his voice dripping with anger. Jake's stomach churned. He wanted to turn and run, but his legs felt frozen. His mind raced. Should he keep walking? Should he do something? He had no idea what was going on, but something about the scene felt wrong. The man with the knife moved toward the other man, who continued to back away. Jake could feel the tension building between them. Then, just as quickly as it started, a twig snapped underfoot, the sound breaking the stillness like a gunshot. Jake's heart leapt in his chest. The men turned toward him. The one with the knife shouted, "Who's there?" Jake didn't wait to find out. Without thinking, he turned and ran as fast as he could, his feet pounding the ground. He could hear the men shouting behind him, but he didn't dare look back. His chest tightened, and his breath came in short gasps. He didn't stop running until he reached his house, slamming the door behind him and locking it quickly. Jake stood there for a moment, his back pressed against the door, his heart racing. He could still hear his breath echoing in his ears. His mind was in a blur, replaying the scene over and over. What had he seen? What should he do? He had never been in a situation like this before. The park was supposed to be safe. It was supposed to be a place to escape, not a place where something like this could happen. He sat down on the floor, his head in his hands, trying to calm himself. He didn't want to think about what he had seen. He didn't want to think about the knife, the fear in the other man's eyes. But the more he tried to push it away, the more the memory stayed with him, gnawing at him from the inside. Jake tried to do his homework, tried to focus on the mundane details of school, but nothing felt normal. Every car that passed by his house, every sound outside, made his heart race. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. Someone knew he had seen something, and now they might come for him. The days passed, and Jake tried to pretend everything was fine. But then the news broke. A man had been found near the park, unconscious and severely injured. The police said it was an attempted robbery. Jake's stomach dropped. He recognized the man's face from the park. It was the one who had been trying to back away, the one who had been afraid. The guilt hit him like a wave. He had seen something important. He knew who had been involved. But the fear of what might happen if he spoke up kept him silent. What if the police didn't believe him? What if those men found out he had witnessed what happened? What if they came after him? Jake didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to handle it. He couldn't keep living in fear, but he wasn't sure if telling the truth would make things better or worse. And so, he stayed quiet, trying to act like nothing had happened. It was then that Jake realized he couldn't carry this secret alone anymore. He had to talk to someone. But who? His mom was busy with work, and he didn't want to worry her. He decided to talk to his best friend, Tyler Johnson, who lived just a few blocks away. Tyler was the one person who might understand. The two had been friends since they were little, and Jake trusted him more than anyone. They had spent countless hours together, playing video games, talking about their favorite bands, and just being kids. Tyler was the one person who wouldn't judge him. After school the next day, Jake went to Tyler's house. Tyler greeted him at the door, his usual friendly smile replaced by concern. "Hey, man, you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Jake hesitated, unsure of how to start. "Tyler, I saw something in the park the other day," he said quietly, his voice trembling. Tyler's brow furrowed. "What do you mean? What did you see?" Jake took a deep breath and told Tyler everything. The argument, the knife, the fear in the other man's eyes. Tyler listened quietly, his expression serious. "You've got to tell someone, Jake," Tyler said after a long pause. "If you don't, they might come after you." Jake shook his head, feeling the weight of his fear. "What if no one believes me? What if they don't do anything? What if they come after us?" Tyler was quiet for a moment, thinking, "Maybe you don't have to tell them everything, just enough so they can figure out who did it. But you can't stay silent. It's not safe." Jake knew Tyler was right, but the thought of speaking up, of getting involved in something so dangerous, terrified him. Still, the more he thought about it, the more he knew that keeping quiet wasn't the answer. Jake's life after the incident in the park felt like a slow-motion blur. He went through the motions of his daily routine. School, homework, helping his mom with chores. But everything felt different. Every time he saw a police car drive by, his heart would skip a beat. The constant hum of anxiety in his chest never quite went away. He kept expecting the knock on the door, the phone call, the moment when everything would finally explode. That knock came 2 days later. It was just after dinner when the doorbell rang. Catherine, tired from another long shift at the hospital, was sitting at the kitchen table sipping a cup of tea. Jake had been playing a video game in the living room, trying to lose himself in the characters and stories on the screen. But when he heard the doorbell, his blood ran cold. He stood up, his heart hammering. He couldn't explain why, but a knot formed in his stomach, a feeling he couldn't shake. Catherine answered the door, her voice soft but polite. Jake lingered by the hallway, listening closely. "Good evening, ma'am," a woman's voice said. Jake's pulse quickened. He knew that voice. He couldn't help himself. He had to move closer, just to see who was there. His eyes widened when he saw the police officers standing at the doorstep. There was a tall, stern-looking woman with dark sunglasses and a short, muscular man with a slight scowl on his face. "Hi, can we help you?" Catherine asked, her tone warm but cautious. "We're looking for Jake Taylor," the man said, his voice even. "Are you the boy's mother?" Catherine nodded, confused. "Yes, but is everything okay? What's this about?" "We need to speak with Jake about a matter concerning the park," the woman said, her tone cold and professional. "May we speak with him?" Jake's stomach lurched. He didn't know what to say, how to react. His mind raced. He had always been good at keeping things together, but this felt different. These weren't just ordinary questions. These were police officers, asking about the park, about what had happened that day. Before Catherine could respond, Jake stepped forward. "I'm Jake," he said, his voice quiet but firm. The officers looked at him, sizing him up for a second before the woman spoke again. "We'd like to ask you a few questions, Jake. It's important, and it won't take long." Jake's heart pounded. He didn't know what to expect, but he couldn't help but feel that something wasn't right. He glanced at his mom, whose face was a mix of worry and confusion. She gave him a small, reassuring smile, but it didn't do much to calm his nerves. Catherine stepped back, allowing the officers inside. She gave Jake a nod, silently encouraging him to speak up if he needed to. Jake had always been close to his mom, but today, the weight of her gaze felt different. There was something unspoken between them, a shared understanding that things weren't as simple as they seemed. They sat down in the living room. The two officers, Officer Harris and Officer Daniels, took their seats opposite Jake. Catherine sat nearby, her eyes fixed on her son. Officer Harris spoke first, her tone direct and calm. "Jake, we're investigating an incident that occurred at the park a few days ago. We know you were there, and we need to ask you about what you saw." Jake swallowed hard, trying to keep his voice steady. He could feel the tension rising in the room. I don't know what you mean," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I didn't see anything." Officer Daniels leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Jake, we know you were there. Someone saw you near the fountain that day. We need your help to piece together what happened." Jake's heart was racing now. He didn't know what to say. The words felt trapped in his throat. He glanced at his mom again, but Catherine's face remained neutral, though her fingers were tapping nervously on her cup. The pressure was building. He knew he couldn't lie forever, but the fear of what might happen if he spoke the truth was suffocating him. Would they believe him? Would they protect him? Or would they think he was involved somehow? Officer Harris seemed to sense his hesitation. She leaned back in her chair, folding her arms across her chest. "Jake, you don't have to tell us everything right now, but you can help us by telling us what you remember. No one is accusing you of anything, but the truth will help us find the person who did this." Jake nodded slowly. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing thoughts. He could feel the eyes of the officers on him, but more than anything, he could feel the weight of his mom's gaze. She was worried, and that made him feel even more conflicted. She didn't know what he had seen, what he was holding back. She trusted him, but did she really know him? I saw two guys," Jake began, his voice barely above a whisper. "They were arguing near the fountain. I think one of them had a knife." Officer Harris raised an eyebrow. "A knife? Did you see anything else?" Jake hesitated. He could feel the memory of the incident flooding back. The way the man had backed away, his hands up in defense, the other man's angry face. He had been so scared. He had run so fast. There was no way he could have stayed to watch what happened next. I didn't see anything after that, Jake said, his voice shaky. I just ran. I didn't want to get involved. The officers exchanged a quick glance. Officer Harris nodded slightly, as if accepting his response, but Officer Daniels wasn't convinced. Jake, I understand that you were scared, but this is serious. Someone is hurt. We need all the information we can get. If you saw something, you need to tell us. Jake swallowed hard, feeling the pressure mounting. He glanced at his mom, who was watching him intently. He wanted to tell her everything, wanted to take her hand and let her know that he wasn't hiding anything anymore. But the fear of the unknown held him back. I don't know if I can help, Jake murmured. Officer Harris stood up, placing a hand on Jake's shoulder. Jake, you don't have to be afraid. But if you know something, anything, it could make all the difference. We'll protect you. Jake looked at the officer's face, her expression softening just slightly. But all Jake could think about was the man with the knife, the way he had looked when their eyes met, the fear in his own chest. He didn't know if he could trust anyone, but the words were stuck inside him. The days that followed Jake's conversation with the police felt like they stretched on forever. He went through his usual routine, school, chores, pretending everything was normal. But nothing felt normal anymore. The weight of the secret he was carrying pressed down on him, suffocating him with every breath he took. Every morning, when he walked to school, his heart raced with the fear that someone was watching him. Every sound, every car that passed by, made his stomach churn. He felt as if the world was closing in on him. The guilt, the fear, the uncertainty. It was all too much for him to handle. He had tried to tell himself that he could keep quiet, that it would all blow over eventually. But deep down, he knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. Jake had always been a good student. He kept his head down, did his work, and didn't draw attention to himself. But now, every time his teacher called on him in class, he felt like all eyes were on him. His classmates, once friendly and carefree, now whispered behind his back. He could feel the stares, the judgment, even if no one said anything. They knew something had happened, and they all assumed Jake knew more than he was letting on. At lunch, Jake found himself sitting alone at a table in the corner of the cafeteria, poking at his food without appetite. The clatter of trays and laughter from his peers felt distant, as if it were happening in another world. Tyler had stopped sitting with him, not because of any falling out, but because Jake had started pulling away. He didn't want to burden Tyler with his fears, and he certainly didn't want anyone asking him about the police. Tyler had been insistent about telling the truth, but Jake wasn't ready to risk it all. Not yet. Jake's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his phone buzzing in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a text from Tyler. Tyler. Hey, you okay? You're looking kind of rough lately. Want to hang out after school? Jake stared at the message for a moment, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He knew he should respond, but the truth felt like a heavy stone in his chest. Tyler had been the one person who understood, who didn't question his silence, but even he was starting to notice something was wrong. What if telling him would only make things worse? Jake. I'm fine. Just tired. Maybe another time. He hit send before he could change his mind. The moment the text was sent, Jake regretted it. He wanted to talk to Tyler, to get everything off his chest. But he was too scared. The truth was like a ticking bomb in his mind, and every second he delayed was another moment it could explode. That afternoon, Jake's anxiety was at an all-time high. He was walking home when he saw the police car parked at the corner of his street. His stomach lurched. Why were they there? Were they looking for him? Had they found something out? He walked past it quickly, his eyes fixed on the pavement, his heart hammering in his chest. The sirens, the flashing lights, the sense of unease that followed him. It was all becoming too much to handle. When Jake got home, he found his mom in the living room, sitting on the couch with a worried look on her face. The moment Jake walked through the door, she stood up. "Jake," Catherine said, her voice soft but firm. "We need to talk." Jake froze. His chest tightened, his palms suddenly clammy. He didn't know what she knew, but the fact that she was asking to talk to him about something made his stomach turn. "What's wrong, Mom?" Jake asked, trying to sound normal. But even to his own ears, his voice was strained, like he was holding his breath. "I spoke with Officer Harris today," Catherine said, her voice gentle but tinged with concern. "She said they've been investigating the park incident, and they're looking for more witnesses. Jake—" She paused, and Jake's heart skipped a beat. He could see the worry in her eyes. He knew she wasn't just asking about the case. She was asking him to tell her the truth, to open up. "I know you're scared," Catherine continued, her voice softer now. "But you don't have to go through this alone. You can talk to me. Whatever it is, I'll understand." Jake felt the knot in his chest tighten. His throat felt dry. He wanted to tell her everything. He wanted to say the words, that he had seen the man with the knife, that he had run, that he had been so terrified. He wanted to tell her how guilty he felt, how he couldn't stop thinking about what happened that day in the park. But the words wouldn't come. They were stuck in his throat, and all he could do was look at his mom, helpless and afraid. I don't know what to say, Mom," Jake whispered, his voice breaking. "I don't know if I can help." Catherine's face softened, and she stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Jake, you don't have to be afraid. Whatever you're going through, we'll figure it out together. But keeping this inside won't help. You're not alone." Jake stared at her for a long time, his mind racing. The silence between them stretched on, heavy and thick. He could see the trust in his mom's eyes, the unconditional love that had always been there. But how could he break her heart by telling her what he knew? How could he live with the consequences of the truth? I just don't know what will happen if I tell the police," Jake whispered. "What if they don't believe me? What if they make things worse?" Catherine knelt in front of him, lifting his chin gently. "Jake, you don't have to do this alone. I'm here, and so are the police. If you tell them the truth, they can help. But you need to tell them, sweetheart. For your own sake." Jake's chest tightened even more. He wanted to tell her everything, wanted to make it stop. But the fear of the unknown kept him silent. He didn't know who to trust anymore. He didn't know what would happen if he spoke out. All he knew was that the more he stayed silent, the heavier the burden became. "I'll try," Jake said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't know what he was agreeing to, but for the first time in days, he felt like a small weight had lifted off his shoulders. The days passed in a blur of unease. Jake found himself stuck in a cycle of anxiety, guilt, and fear. He was constantly on edge, his mind racing, always wondering if today would be the day someone would find out what he knew. Every time he walked through the hallways at school, his classmates' whispers seemed to echo in his ears, and every glance felt like an accusation. He knew they were talking about him. Everyone knew about the police. Everyone knew Jake had seen something, But no one knew the full story. That Friday afternoon, Jake's worst fear came true. As Jake walked home from school, he noticed a black car parked on the corner of his street. His heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the first time he had seen the car, but this time it was parked in front of his house. His breath caught in his throat as he stopped in his tracks. The car wasn't there for a good reason. He could feel it. For a moment, Jake considered running. He could turn around, go the long way around the block, and pretend he hadn't seen the car. But then, his mind flashed back to his mom's words. "You're not alone. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." Jake couldn't keep running. He had to confront the fear head-on, even if it terrified him. Taking a deep breath, Jake walked the rest of the way home, his heart pounding with every step. When he reached the door, he pushed it open cautiously, glancing around. His mom wasn't home yet, and the house was eerily quiet. The black car was still parked outside, but there was no sign of movement. Jake stood by the door for a moment, unsure what to do next. Should he call the police? But what if it was nothing? What if it was just a coincidence? His mind spun with the possibilities, but there was no time for indecision. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out to see a text from Tyler. Tyler: "Hey man, you okay? Heard some rumors going around about you. People are saying the cops are looking for you. What's going on?" Jake's hands trembled as he typed a response. "Jake, I'm fine. Just tired. I'll talk to you soon." He put the phone back in his pocket, feeling the weight of his decision. He couldn't keep lying to his friend, but he wasn't ready to tell him everything. Tyler had been persistent, but Jake still couldn't bring himself to spill the truth. The secret was too big, too dangerous. Suddenly, Jake's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. His pulse shot up, and he froze for a moment, the fear surging through him. He couldn't ignore it. He had to answer. With slow, deliberate steps, Jake made his way to the door and opened it. Standing on the other side was Detective Mark Bennett, a tall man in a dark suit, with a serious expression on his face. He wasn't alone. Another man, shorter and more rugged, stood behind him, a police badge clipped to his belt. "Jake Taylor?" Bennett asked, his voice calm but authoritative. Jake nodded, his throat dry. "Yes?" "We need to talk," Bennett said, stepping forward. The man behind him remained silent, but watched Jake intently. Jake's heart pounded harder. His mind raced, trying to figure out what was happening. The last time he had spoken to Detective Bennett, he had kept his silence. Now, he could feel the tension in the air. There was no running from this. It was time to face the truth. "Can we come in?" Bennett asked, his gaze steady. Jake stepped aside, his breath shaky. He didn't know what to expect, but he had a sinking feeling in his gut. As they entered the house, Jake's mind raced. What had they found? What did they know? "We're investigating the incident in the park," Bennett said, his voice low. "We need your help to clear things up. You've been very quiet about what you saw, Jake. We need you to be honest with us." Jake stood frozen in the hallway, his back pressed against the wall. His mind flashed to the events in the park, the man with the knife, the fear, the run. It felt like a distant memory, but it was still fresh, still terrifying. His chest tightened as he struggled to keep his composure. I don't know what to say," Jake whispered. "I already told the police everything I saw." Bennett didn't flinch. "Jake, we know there's more. Someone who was at the scene has told us you know something important. We need you to speak up. If you don't, things could get worse." Jake's stomach twisted. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Worse? How could it get worse than this? What do you mean? Jake's voice cracked. I told you everything. You didn't, Bennett said, his tone firm but not unkind. There are people out there who are involved in this, Jake. Dangerous people. And if you don't help us, if you don't tell us everything you know, we can't protect you. Do you understand that? Jake's head swam. He could feel his thoughts starting to spiral. The pressure was unbearable. His hands shook, his breath coming faster. He couldn't keep hiding. He couldn't keep running. He had to make a choice. I saw the man with the knife, Jake began, his voice barely above a whisper. He swallowed hard, trying to steady himself. I didn't stick around. I just ran. But I know what happened. I heard them talking. I think I know who did it. Bennett's eyes softened slightly. Jake, you're doing the right thing, but you need to tell us who was involved. If you know anything more, now is the time to speak. Jake's mind raced. He could feel the weight of his words pressing on him. The man with the knife, the one who had been threatening the other man, had a face Jake couldn't forget. But the face of the man who had been attacked was just as clear in his memory. And the worst part was, Jake knew the man. He wasn't a stranger. I know who the other man was, Jake said, his voice trembling. But I can't say it. Bennett's expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed slightly. You need to, Jake. You're not alone in this. If you tell us everything, we can help. But you have to trust us. Jake looked at Bennett, and then at the other officer, whose face was impassive. He didn't know who to trust. His hands clenched into fists. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about everyone. And he had to decide once and for all whether to break his silence and face the consequences. The decision loomed over him. He could feel the walls closing in. Jake sat in the living room, his mind spinning as the officers left. The weight of their visit was still pressing down on him, suffocating him with every breath he took. He had barely been able to speak, barely able to process what had just happened. He had said something, but it wasn't enough. It was never enough. His mother, Catherine, had come home a few minutes after the officers left, looking as tired as ever from her long shift. She greeted Jake with a quick hug, but when she saw the look on his face, the worry lines deepened on her forehead. Jake, what happened? Why do you look so? She trailed off, her words hanging in the air, unspoken. She didn't need to finish the sentence. He could see it in her eyes. She knew something was wrong. I talked to them, Jake said, his voice barely a whisper. The police. They know more than I told them. I think they know. They know I'm not telling the whole truth. Catherine's face softened. Jake, honey, whatever it is, you need to tell them. The truth will set things right. I can't, Mom, Jake replied, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. If I say anything, things will get worse. I don't know what will happen. Catherine sat down beside him, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. Jake, this isn't something you can handle alone. If you know who did this, you have to tell them. You can't carry this burden forever. Jake looked at his mom, her eyes filled with worry. She didn't understand. She didn't know what it was like to feel the constant weight of fear, the paranoia, the knowledge that he was holding something back that could change everything. The guilt was eating him alive, but so was the fear. What if telling the truth meant losing everything? I saw him, Mom, Jake finally said, his voice breaking. I know who the other man was. I know who was involved. But it's someone I know, someone I see every day. He trailed off, his throat closing up. Catherine's eyes widened with concern. Who, Jake? You have to tell me who. Jake swallowed hard, the truth threatening to escape. But the fear of what would happen if he said it out loud kept him silent. He could feel the weight of the name sitting on the tip of his tongue. It was like a bomb, ready to explode, but he couldn't bring himself to pull the pin. "I can't, Mom," he whispered. "I just can't." Catherine didn't push him further, but the disappointment in her eyes was palpable. She wanted to help him, wanted to ease his burden, but there was nothing she could do if he wouldn't let her in. "I understand," she said softly, her voice filled with resignation. "But you need to understand something, Jake. Keeping this secret, letting the fear control you, it's not going to make things go away. It's only going to get worse. You have to trust someone, even if it's scary. The truth is, the only thing that will set you free." Jake didn't answer. Instead, he sat there, his mind racing, his hands shaking as he tried to hold back the flood of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He knew his mom was right, but the price of telling the truth felt too high. The fear of what would happen next paralyzed him. What would the police do? Would the people involved come after him? Could he live with the consequences of exposing the truth? That night, Jake lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Every creak in the house, every gust of wind outside made his heart race. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. He couldn't escape the knowledge that the truth he was hiding was becoming too big to ignore. The next morning, Jake woke up to find that the feeling hadn't gone away. The walls were closing in on him. He tried to focus on his breakfast, but the taste in his mouth was metallic, his stomach twisted into knots. His phone buzzed on the table, and he glanced at it. It was another message from Tyler. Tyler. "Hey, man. I saw the police again. They were asking about you. Are you okay?" Jake stared at the message, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He wanted to respond, wanted to tell Tyler everything, but the words wouldn't come. He felt trapped, like he was suffocating under the weight of his own silence. "I can't do this anymore," Jake whispered to himself, the words escaping before he could stop them. He had to face the truth. He had to speak up. The longer he kept the secret, the more it would destroy him, and the more dangerous it became. As Jake sat in the kitchen, a knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. His heart skipped a beat. Could it be the police again? Or worse, the people involved in the crime? He felt his stomach turn as he stood up, his legs trembling. He took a deep breath and walked toward the door. When he opened it, he was met by Detective Bennett and another officer, Officer Daniels. Both of them looked serious, but there was something different in their eyes this time. They weren't just here to ask questions. They were here to push him further, to force him to confront the truth. "Jake," Bennett said, his voice firm but not unkind. "We need to talk. It's time to end the silence." Jake's stomach dropped, and for the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of hope. This could be the moment when everything changed. He didn't have to hide anymore. The truth was right in front of him, and he was finally ready to face it. I know who did it," Jake said, his voice trembling. "I saw him in the park. I didn't want to say anything, but I can't stay silent anymore." Bennett's expression softened just a fraction, and he motioned for Jake to sit. "We're listening, Jake. You're doing the right thing." Jake took a deep breath, his hands still shaking. The words were heavy on his tongue, but this time he didn't hold them back. He was ready. He had to be. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he sat down across from Detective Bennett and Officer Daniels. The weight of his words hung in the air, and he could feel the anxiety gnawing at him, but for the first time in what felt like forever, he knew that he was doing the right thing. He had kept the secret for so long, but now the burden seemed just a little bit lighter, even though the fear was still present. Bennett leaned forward, his expression calm, but there was an intensity behind his eyes that Jake hadn't seen before. "Jake," he said gently, "you said you know who did this. We need you to tell us everything." Jake swallowed hard, the truth catching in his throat. He had been running from it for so long, but now it was time to confront it. He didn't know what would happen after he told them, but he was past the point of no return. The truth had to come out, no matter the consequences. "I saw two men in the park that day," Jake began, his voice shaking but steady. "One of them was the man who was hurt, the one you found near the fountain. He wasn't just a random person. He was arguing with the other guy, the one with the knife." Officer Daniels nodded, taking notes. "And you're sure this was the man who was injured?" Jake nodded quickly, his mind replaying the scene. "Yes, he was the one backing away, the one trying to get away from the fight. I remember seeing him stumble. He was scared. He didn't want to be there." "And the other man?" Bennett asked. His voice was even, but Jake could hear the tension building in his words. Jake hesitated, but the truth spilled out in one breath. "The other man, I know him. I know his face. He's not a stranger. He's a teacher at my school." The room went quiet. Bennett and Daniels exchanged a look, but they didn't say anything at first. Jake could feel the heat rise in his cheeks, his mouth suddenly dry. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but the reaction from the officers wasn't one of disbelief or shock. Instead, they seemed to take his words seriously, even though the situation was growing more complicated by the second. "Who?" Daniels asked finally, his tone flat. "Which teacher?" Jake's throat tightened, and for a moment he thought he might choke on the name. He had known it would come to this, but now that it was happening, the reality of what he was saying hit him like a wave. "Mr. Hargrove," he whispered, barely able to say the name aloud. "My history teacher." Bennett's eyes narrowed slightly, and Daniels stiffened. "Mr. Hargrove? Are you sure?" Jake nodded again. "I'm sure. I saw him there, and I know it was him. He was the one holding the knife. He was arguing with the other guy, and I think it was about something important. Something bigger than just a fight. But I couldn't stay. I ran." Bennett leaned back in his chair, processing what Jake had just said. The silence in the room was heavy, the implications of Jake's words hanging over them. Mr. Hargrove had been a respected teacher in the community, known for his passion for history and his dedication to his students. To hear that Jake had seen him involved in a violent crime was hard to believe, but the evidence was stacking up. The pieces were falling into place. "What did they argue about?" Bennett asked, breaking the silence. Jake hesitated, trying to recall the details. "I don't know for sure, but I heard them mention something about a deal going wrong. Mr. Hargrove kept saying something like, 'I told you this was going to end badly.' It didn't make sense at the time, but now I think it might have been about something illegal." Bennett stood up, walking over to the window, his face serious. "A deal? What kind of deal are you talking about, Jake?" Jake felt a knot form in his stomach. He didn't know much about deals like that, but he had an idea. The word deal wasn't just some harmless argument. It was the kind of thing that happened when drugs or money were involved. Jake couldn't understand why Mr. Hargrove, someone who had always been so kind and knowledgeable in class, would be caught up in something like that. But the more Jake thought about it, the more everything began to make sense. The tension in the park, the way the man had tried to get away, the fear in Mr. Hargrove's voice when he'd spoken to the other man. I think "I think Mr. Hargrove might have been involved in something illegal," Jake said, his voice barely a whisper. "I think he was in a bad situation, and he didn't know how to get out of it." Bennett and Daniels exchanged another look. There was a slight shift in the air, a new understanding between them. "We need to act fast," Bennett said, his voice grim. "If Mr. Hargrove is involved in something dangerous, we can't wait around for him to make a move." Jake felt his pulse race. This was it. The truth was out now. He had said the words, and there was no going back. Mr. Hargrove's involvement in the crime was going to change everything. It wasn't just about Jake anymore. It was about everyone who had been affected by the chaos that had spiraled out of control. "What happens now?" Jake asked, his voice unsteady. Bennett turned back to face him. "We're going to investigate this further, Jake. But you've done the right thing by coming forward. You've helped us uncover a much bigger problem. And now, we need to make sure that we stop it before it goes any further." Jake swallowed hard. He had known that speaking up was the right thing to do, but hearing the weight of his words now, knowing what he had set in motion, made the reality of it all feel even more overwhelming. "I'm not sure I can do this," Jake admitted quietly. "What if they come after me? What if they find out I said something?" Bennett's expression softened slightly. "Jake, we're going to make sure you're safe. You're not alone in this anymore. But you have to trust us. And you need to stay strong." For the first time in days, Jake felt a flicker of hope. The truth was out, and things were starting to move. But he knew the hardest part was still ahead of him. The battle to stop whatever was happening, whatever Mr. Hargrove had been involved in, was far from over. The days that followed Jake's confession were a blur of police activity and whispered conversations. Detective Bennett and Officer Daniels had promised Jake that he would be protected. But as the hours passed, the reality of what he had done, what he had revealed, started to settle in, like a cold, heavy weight on his chest. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that things were spiraling out of control. He had told the truth, and now the consequences were unfolding in front of him. The officers had taken his statement seriously, but Jake knew there was more to the story than what he had seen in the park. There was more going on, and he had unwittingly opened the door to a much darker world than he had ever imagined. Jake spent most of his time at home, trying to stay out of sight, keeping his head down. He stayed away from school, knowing the whispers and stares would be unbearable. It wasn't just about the police anymore. It was about everyone around him, the people he had trusted, the people he had grown up with, and the choices they had made that had led them down this dangerous path. The phone calls from the police became more frequent. Detective Bennett checked in regularly, ensuring Jake that they were making progress in the investigation. They had already begun looking into Mr. Hargrove's background, digging into his personal life, and questioning anyone who might have known him better. The more they uncovered, the more complicated things became. But Jake's mind wasn't on the investigation itself. His thoughts were consumed with the consequences of what he had done. What if those people, the ones Mr. Hargrove had been involved with, came after him? What if they came after his mom? Jake couldn't stop worrying about her safety, even though she was doing everything she could to stay strong for him. She didn't know the full extent of what was going on, and Jake wasn't sure if he should tell her. He didn't want to scare her more than she already was. But it wasn't just fear that kept him awake at night. It was guilt. He had known something important, and he had been silent. His silence had allowed things to go further, to escalate. He could have stopped it earlier, but he had been too scared to act. Now, the weight of that fear was suffocating him. One afternoon, as Jake sat in his room, the silence in the house was shattered by a loud knock on the door. His heart skipped a beat, and he froze. It was the kind of knock that felt different, urgent, almost frantic. Jake crept to the window, his heart pounding in his chest. He saw two figures standing on the porch. The first was Detective Bennett, and the second was a woman Jake didn't recognize. Her expression was serious, her eyes sharp with determination. She wore a dark jacket, and she looked like someone who wasn't here to waste time. Jake's stomach churned. Something was wrong. He had a bad feeling, and it made him hesitate before opening the door. "Jake," Bennett said, his voice firm but gentle. "We need to talk. Now." Jake stepped back, his breath shallow. He didn't know what had happened, but the urgency in Bennett's voice made him feel like something important had just shifted. Something had changed. "Come in," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. The two officers entered, and the woman introduced herself. "I'm Agent Melissa Clark," she said. "I've been assigned to your case, Jake. I've been briefed on the situation, and I need to ask you a few more questions." Jake swallowed hard. He wasn't sure he could handle more questions, but he knew he didn't have a choice. This was bigger than him now. The moment he had opened up about Mr. Hargrove, he had entered a world that was far more complicated than he could have ever imagined. "What's going on?" Jake asked, his voice trembling. "Is it about Mr. Hargrove?" Bennett nodded, his eyes serious. "Yes, we've uncovered some disturbing information, Jake. This is much bigger than we thought. We're starting to connect some dots, but we need your help to get the final piece." Jake's mind raced. What did that mean? What had they uncovered? The last thing he wanted was to be dragged deeper into this mess. He had already given his statement. What else could they possibly need from him? "Do you recognize these people?" Agent Clark asked, pulling out a folder and opening it to reveal several photographs. She laid them out on the table in front of Jake. Jake's eyes flicked over the photos. They were of people he didn't recognize, except for one. One man stood out among the others. His face was familiar, but not in a way that made Jake feel comfortable. He had seen this man once before, in passing. He was someone who had visited the school on several occasions, a man who had often been around the halls, but never seemed to be a part of the school itself. A businessman, perhaps, but there was something about the way he looked in the photo that made Jake uneasy. "Do you know him?" Agent Clark asked. "This man, right here. His name is Vince Matthews. He's involved in a large criminal network, and we believe Mr. Hargrove is connected to him." Jake's stomach sank. He had heard rumors about Vince Matthews, rumors that no one ever took seriously. He was the kind of person who dealt in the shadows, never really involved with the town, but always lurking on the edge. "I don't know him," Jake said, his voice shaky. But even as he said the words, a small part of him wasn't sure if he was telling the truth. He had seen Vince Matthews in the park the day of the incident, hadn't he? It was all starting to come together, and Jake's mind was struggling to keep up with the revelations. Agent Clark leaned forward, her gaze intense. "Jake, I know this is hard, but you're the key to everything. If you know anything about Vince Matthews, or how he's connected to Mr. Hargrove, now is the time to tell us." Jake took a deep breath. The weight of everything was starting to overwhelm him. He wasn't sure he could do this. He wasn't sure he could carry this responsibility any longer. But he knew that if he stayed silent, the consequences would be even worse. I think I've seen him in the park before," Jake admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "He was there that day. I didn't recognize him at first, but now I remember. He was with Mr. Hargrove. They were talking. They were making a deal." Bennett and Agent Clark exchanged another look. Jake could feel the magnitude of what he had just said. He had just confirmed that everything was connected. The park, the attack, the people involved, and now Vince Matthews. Everything was coming to light. "We need to act fast," Agent Clark said, her voice sharp. "We don't have much time. Vince Matthews is dangerous, and if he thinks we're getting too close, he won't hesitate to cover his tracks." Jake's heart raced. He didn't know what that meant for him or his mom, but he knew that everything was changing. The fear, the uncertainty, the guilt. It was all building toward something he couldn't control. He had to keep moving forward. He had no choice. The next few days felt like an eternity for Jake. He couldn't shake the feeling that things were moving too quickly, that everything he had done, everything he had said, had set off a chain of events that couldn't be undone. The truth was out now, and there was no way back. But the fear that had been gnawing at him for weeks only grew stronger. It wasn't just the fear of being discovered anymore. It was the fear of what might happen next. Jake spent most of his time at home, trying to stay out of sight. His mom, Catherine, was still working long shifts at the hospital, and he spent the days pacing the house, waiting for the inevitable. He didn't know what would happen, but every knock at the door, every unexpected sound made his heart race. The police had stepped up their presence in the neighborhood. There were more patrols now, and Jake couldn't help but notice the occasional officer parked on the street near his house. He was grateful for the protection, but it also made him feel like a prisoner in his own home. It was as if the walls were closing in on him from every side. One afternoon, after an especially long day of waiting, Jake was sitting in the living room, his feet on the coffee table as he absently flipped through a magazine. The house was quiet, but the stillness only seemed to amplify the sound of his own thoughts. His phone buzzed on the table, breaking the silence. It was a text from Tyler. "Tyler. Hey man, I need to talk to you. Can you meet up after school? It's about the whole thing with the cops." Jake felt his stomach drop. Tyler hadn't been the same since the police started showing up. He hadn't spoken to Jake as much, and whenever they did, there was always an edge of tension in his voice. It was as if Tyler knew there was something more Jake wasn't telling him, but didn't know what to do with that knowledge. Jake stared at the message for a long moment, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He wanted to talk to Tyler. He wanted to tell him everything, to unload the weight that had been sitting on his chest for days. But he knew that if he did, there was no turning back. Once Tyler knew the full truth, there was no way to protect him from the fallout. The consequences of speaking up were bigger than just Jake. "Jake, I don't know if I can. Things are getting complicated. Maybe later." He hit send and immediately regretted it. Tyler needed to know what was going on, but Jake couldn't bring himself to tell him. It was safer this way. Safer for both of them. He tossed his phone on the couch and stood up, pacing again. He tried to focus on something else, but the nagging feeling in his chest wouldn't go away. He was waiting for something to happen. He could feel it in his bones. And then, just as he began to convince himself he was imagining things, the phone rang. Jake's heart nearly stopped as he picked up the phone, unsure of what he'd hear on the other end. "Jake," a familiar voice said. It was Detective Bennett. "We need to meet, now." Jake's stomach churned. He couldn't explain why, but something in Bennett's voice sent a wave of dread over him. The urgency was palpable, and Jake didn't even need to ask why. He knew. Something had happened. Something big. "Where do you want to meet?" Jake asked, his voice low, barely able to mask his anxiety. "Meet me at the precinct. We've got something important to discuss," Bennett replied, his tone firm. Jake didn't ask any more questions. He hung up the phone, the weight of the conversation settling into his bones. He felt a rush of panic. What did they know now? How much further had the investigation gone? And what was about to change? Later that evening, Jake arrived at the police precinct. The cold, sterile building made him feel even more uneasy. The walls seemed to press in on him as he walked through the front door, his footsteps echoing on the hard tile floor. He was led to a small conference room at the back of the precinct, and there, seated across the table, were Detective Bennett and Agent Clark. Both of them looked more serious than usual, and Jake could tell that something had shifted. The atmosphere in the room felt heavier than ever. "Jake, thank you for coming," Bennett said, motioning for him to sit down. "We don't have much time." Jake took a seat, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He didn't speak. He wasn't sure if he could. "Jake," Bennett began, his voice calm but with an edge of urgency. "We've made some breakthroughs in the case. We've connected Vince Matthews to several high-profile crimes in the area, including illegal deals involving drugs and weapons. But here's the thing. We're getting close, and we think Matthews is onto us." Jake's stomach dropped. He had known things were getting serious, but hearing the reality of the situation, hearing how close they were to uncovering everything, made it feel so much more real. "We believe that Mr. Hargrove was caught in the middle of a deal that went wrong," Agent Clark said, her eyes hard with resolve. "He got involved with the wrong people, and it's clear that Matthews doesn't take kindly to anyone who crosses him. We've already lost a few leads. People who might have known something have gone missing." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. His mind raced, trying to keep up with the information. "You're telling me Matthews is dangerous, and that Mr. Hargrove was part of this criminal network?" Bennett nodded. "That's right. And we believe that he was being manipulated, possibly blackmailed into working with Matthews. But the bottom line is, Matthews is a threat, and he's not going to stop until he gets what he wants." Jake's mind raced. The realization that this wasn't just about the park anymore, that the whole town could be caught in the crossfire of this criminal operation, hit him like a ton of bricks. He had been terrified before, but now the fear was overwhelming. "What do you need me to do?" Jake asked, his voice shaking. "We need you to stay alert," Bennett said, his tone stern. "Matthews is a slippery one, and we think he might come after anyone who has information. We need you to be aware of your surroundings. If anything feels off, if anyone approaches you, you call us. Immediately." Jake nodded, his throat tight. He understood. But the weight of it all felt too much. The fear, the pressure, the uncertainty of what would happen next. It was all too overwhelming. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that his life had become a series of ticking clocks, each second leading to something inevitable, something he couldn't control. Every sound, every movement around him seemed to carry a hidden meaning. He couldn't escape it. It was as if the entire world was closing in, one piece at a time. Over the next few days, things only got worse. Detective Bennett had kept his promise to protect Jake, and the police presence in the area had only increased. But no matter how many officers patrolled the streets or how many patrol cars were parked near his house, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. Matthews, the man they were after, was too elusive, too dangerous. The worst part was the uncertainty. Jake had told the truth. He had revealed what he had seen. But now, every move he made felt like it was being watched. Even though Detective Bennett had reassured him that he was safe, Jake couldn't help but feel exposed, like he was the target, like everything he did was being tracked. Jake was sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone absent-mindedly, when he heard the familiar sound of footsteps outside. His heart skipped a beat, his mind instantly jumping to conclusions. The doorbell rang shortly after. He stood up quickly, his feet moving of their own accord. His hands were cold, his palms clammy. He walked toward the door, every step heavy with dread. Could it be the police again? Or someone else? When Jake opened the door, it wasn't who he expected. Standing on the porch was Tyler, looking hesitant, his face drawn with concern. He hadn't seen Tyler in days, and the sight of him was both a relief and a reminder of everything Jake was hiding. "Hey," Tyler said, his voice quieter than usual. "Can we talk?" Jake stepped aside without saying a word. Tyler stepped in, glancing around the room as if searching for something. The silence between them was uncomfortable, like something was hanging in the air that neither of them wanted to address. Jake closed the door behind him, his throat tightening. "You've been avoiding me," Tyler said, his voice serious. "I know something's going on, Jake. The police. They've been asking about you. People at school are talking. I don't know what's happening, but I'm not stupid. I know it's bad." Jake didn't answer right away. He knew Tyler was right, but the words felt trapped in his chest. How could he explain everything? How could he tell his best friend the full truth, the terrifying truth, without dragging him into the mess that had become Jake's life? "I don't want to get you involved," Jake said finally, his voice rough. "It's too dangerous. You don't understand." Tyler's expression darkened, but he didn't look angry, just concerned. "I get that you're scared, but I'm not some kid who doesn't get what's happening. I'm not going to just sit here while you go through this alone." Jake's hands balled into fists at his sides. He had never felt more conflicted in his life. Tyler was his best friend, and the thought of telling him everything seemed impossible. But at the same time, Jake didn't want to shut him out any longer. He didn't want to push him away when he needed support the most. It's Mr. Hargrove," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's involved with some really dangerous people, and I saw him that day in the park. He was the one with the knife." Tyler's eyes widened, a mix of shock and disbelief crossing his face. "What? Mr. Hargrove? The teacher? Are you serious?" Jake nodded, his stomach tight. "I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to think he was involved in something like this, but I saw him. And now I'm caught up in something way bigger than I can handle. The cops, they've been asking me all these questions, and I can't stop thinking about it. I don't know what's going to happen." Tyler shook his head slowly, trying to process the information. "So, you're telling me that Mr. Hargrove is working with these criminals? With that guy, Vince Matthews?" Jake sighed. "Yes, that's what I think. And the worst part is, I think they're still after me. After us." The weight of Jake's words seemed to settle in the air between them. Tyler stood silently for a moment, his eyes searching Jake's face, as if looking for any sign that this was all a mistake, that there was some way out of this madness. "You can't keep this a secret, Jake," Tyler said finally, his voice firm. "The police need to know everything. They need to know who's involved, and they need to protect you." Jake shook his head. "It's not that simple. What if I tell them, and they don't believe me? What if they don't protect me? I don't know who I can trust anymore." Tyler's face softened. "Jake, you've got to trust someone. You can't carry this weight on your own. If they're after you, it's not just your life on the line. It's your mom's, too." The mention of his mom made Jake's heart skip a beat. Of course, Tyler was right. Catherine had been so focused on taking care of him, so strong for him through everything. But Jake hadn't fully realized until now just how much danger she might be in. If Matthews and his people knew Jake was involved, they wouldn't hesitate to go after her. I know," Jake said, his voice heavy with guilt. "I'm scared for her too. I don't know what to do. I don't know if I can protect her." Tyler placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. "You don't have to protect her alone. We can do this together. You don't have to face this on your own." Jake nodded slowly, the weight of the decision bearing down on him. He knew Tyler was right. He couldn't keep this all to himself. He couldn't continue living in the shadows, terrified that someone would come for him or his mom. But the fear was still there, like a cold hand pressing against his chest. The danger was closing in. Matthews was still out there, still watching, and Jake knew it was only a matter of time before everything came to a head. The days after Jake confided in Tyler felt like a blur. He knew that things were about to escalate. They had to be. It was clear that the investigation into Vince Matthews and his criminal activities had reached a critical point, and Jake's involvement in the whole thing couldn't be ignored any longer. The fear that had gripped him for so long had started to loosen its hold, but only just. Now, Jake had to face the reality that his life was no longer his own. Tyler had been a constant presence, his unwavering support making Jake feel less alone, even when everything around him felt like it was falling apart. Together, they began to piece together what had happened that day in the park, working with Detective Bennett and Agent Clark to connect the dots. They weren't going to let the story go untold. Jake had done the right thing by speaking up, and now he had to finish what he had started. One evening, as Jake and Tyler sat at his kitchen table, talking through the details once more, Jake's phone buzzed. It was a message from Detective Bennett. "Detective Bennett, we need to meet. It's time to take action." Jake felt his pulse quicken. This was it. The moment everything would finally come to light. He showed the message to Tyler, who nodded gravely. "Let's do this," Tyler said, his voice steady. The two of them made their way to the police precinct later that evening. The streets were quiet, the dim lights casting long shadows across the pavement. But for Jake, it felt as though the world was holding its breath. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew that whatever happened next would change everything. At the precinct, Detective Bennett and Agent Clark were waiting for them in the same small conference room. The mood was tense, the air thick with anticipation. When Jake sat down across from them, the weight of the situation settled heavily on his shoulders. This wasn't just about him anymore. It wasn't even just about Mr. Hargrove or Vince Matthews. This was about stopping something bigger, something that had been lurking in the shadows for far too long. "We've made our move," Bennett said, his voice calm but urgent. "We've gathered enough evidence, and we believe we can take down Vince Matthews and his network. We need your help, Jake. You're the key to everything." Jake's stomach tightened, but there was no going back now. He had already walked this far, and he wasn't turning back. "I'm ready," Jake said, his voice steady, though his heart was pounding. Agent Clark handed Jake a file, filled with photographs, documents, and notes about Matthews and his operations. As Jake flipped through the pages, a cold realization set in. Matthews wasn't just a small-time criminal. He was involved in trafficking, illegal weapons, and several violent incidents across the state. Mr. Hargrove had been just one piece in the larger puzzle, but Jake's testimony was the linchpin they needed to make the case. "We're going to move quickly," Bennett said. "We have Matthews under surveillance, but we need to make sure we catch him before he disappears. Your statement, Jake, is what ties everything together. It's time we put an end to this." Jake took a deep breath, his mind racing with everything that had led up to this moment. The fear, the guilt, the uncertainty. It was all culminating in this one chance to stop the people who had been pulling the strings from the shadows. "What do you need me to do?" Jake asked, his voice firm. "Stay with us," Bennett said. "We'll keep you safe. You won't be alone in this. But we need you to testify when the time comes. When we move in on Matthews, you'll be crucial to our case. Your testimony will be the final nail in the coffin." Jake nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He was terrified. terrified of what would happen when they moved in, terrified of what Matthews might do in retaliation. But for the first time in weeks, Jake also felt something else. Resolve. The truth had been waiting to come out, and now it was. Over the next few days, Jake and Tyler remained at the precinct, working closely with Detective Bennett and Agent Clark. They kept a low profile, staying out of sight, as Matthews's operation began to crumble under the weight of the investigation. The team was prepared for a final confrontation, and Jake could sense the tension building. It was only a matter of time before the storm would hit. Then, one night, it happened. Jake was in his room when his phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen, and it was another message from Detective Bennett. Detective Bennett, it's happening now. Stay put, and stay safe. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He turned to Tyler, who was sitting on his bed, eyes glued to the screen of his own phone. Tyler looked up when he saw Jake's face. "They're moving in, aren't they?" Tyler asked, his voice quiet but knowing. Jake nodded, his throat tight. "Yeah, it's all coming to an end." Minutes later, they heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The noise grew louder, and Jake's chest tightened. He knew it was happening. The police were moving in on Matthews's hideout. There was no turning back now. It felt like the entire world was holding its breath. Suddenly, Jake's phone rang, and he quickly answered it. "Jake," Detective Bennett's voice came through, urgent. "We need you to be ready. This is it. Matthews is cornered. We need you to testify as soon as we have him. Stay calm and stay with us." Jake could hear the tension in Bennett's voice, but he also heard the determination. The time had come. They were about to bring everything into the light, and Jake's role was pivotal. Minutes later, the doorbell rang, and Jake jumped. He went to the door, his pulse racing. He opened it to find Detective Bennett standing outside with several officers, their faces serious but relieved. "We've got him," Bennett said with a smile that was rare for him. "It's over." Jake let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. The fear, the uncertainty, the tension of the past weeks had finally come to a head. And now it was finished. Matthews had been caught, and the people behind him were going down as well. Later that evening, Jake stood with his mom, watching as the police took Matthews away. He could feel the weight of it all beginning to lift, piece by piece. His mom squeezed his hand, her eyes filled with pride and relief. He had made it through. He had faced his fears, and in doing so, he had helped bring down something far bigger than himself. "I'm proud of you, Jake," Catherine said softly. "You did the right thing." Jake looked at her, his chest swelling with emotion. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mom." And as they stood there, together, watching the end of a chapter that had consumed their lives for so long, Jake finally felt like he could breathe again.